Good morning, everyone. I think you can probably hear me. Can you hear me okay? The sound level? Good? Okay. Right. So, uh, I want to talk this morning about don't know mind. Don't know mind. But I want to relate it specifically, more specifically, to a question that was raised last week on the question of suffering. I think it was Stephen who asked this question, right? Stephen? Yeah. It's a good question. And I don't want to put words into Stephen's mouth, but one of the things that really that it got me to wondering about, and this was part of what he raised and part of what was discussed last week, is the idea that life is suffering, or even all life is suffering, or existence is suffering. That had something to do with what you were bringing up, didn't it, Stephen? Yeah. It's funny, when someone asks a question, it or says anything, it's always easy to go off on a tangent, thinking that you're relating to what someone else has thought or asked or said, and really you're just following your own thinking. But so it's good to check back with the person who raised it in the first place to see if it has anything to do with what they were talking about. But one of the reasons why I want to relate this to don't know mind is because if you look into any question, and the Buddha left us lots of little breadcrumbs to follow. And breadcrumbs, I think, is a good analogy. If you pick up one breadcrumb and say this is it, then that's not how breadcrumbs work. The way breadcrumbs work is you find one breadcrumb, and then you look for the next one, and then you look for the next one, and you keep following them. And so, and that's the don't know mind. Don't know mind is the mind that follows one breadcrumb after another, instead of just grabbing the first breadcrumb and saying, aha, this is it. So that if you look into a subject, a question, whether it's a koan or some basic teaching of Buddhism or anything else, whatever you find must lead to something else. So you have to keep looking. And so even the four noble truths, which includes the truth of suffering, starts with the truth of suffering, is one of the most basic teachings of Buddhism. And so it's often thought of as the first thing that the Buddha taught, which is not necessarily true. It's one version of how things worked out is that the Buddha gave a very long teaching while still seated under the Bodhi tree, and that teaching was the Avatamsaka Sutra. And no one understood it. And it wasn't that so why if that's the case, if that's what happened, then why did he do that? Why did the Buddha start by giving a teaching that no one could understand, and then back up and give more basic teachings like the Four Noble Truths? So because he wanted to get, well, one reason that he did that was to ensure that people would have don't know mind. If you start with the Avatamsaka Sutra, which is huge, thousands of pages in book form, if you start with the Avatamsaka Sutra, then as you go along and you pick up various breadcrumbs, you should always think back to the Avatamsaka Sutra to remind yourself that you still don't know. So in yeah, and Zen Master Sung San, he was so Zen Master Sung San, like I said, he's my teacher's teacher, our teacher's teacher, Zen Master Degak's teacher. He was very fond of this phrase, "Don't know mind," and but he himself was a very highly educated person, very knowledgeable, a great Buddhist scholar. He wasn't very big on teaching Buddhist ideas in a systematic way, but he left a lot of breadcrumbs. One of the ways that he left breadcrumbs for us is the chanting that he taught, and if you so he taught, the morning and evening bell chant. He taught the Heart Sutra. He taught the homage to the three jewels. He taught the Great Dharani. He taught the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra. And then also he taught these other chants where we recite the names of Kwanzaa Bosal and Jijang Bosal and Amitabha and Shakyamuni Buddha. And if you look into those chants, and if you ask, and of course, if people asked Zen Master Sung San, what do these chants mean? Which I did once. I asked him a very specific question about one chant in particular that had a bodhisattva in it that I didn't. Junjie Bosal. We have a representative of Junjie Bosal here this morning with us. I asked him, what who is Junjie Bosal? Tell me, just give me something. Because in the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra, which is a long chant that Zen Master Sung San encouraged everyone to learn and to practice, there's a long section of that chant is all about Junjie Bosal. So I said, who is that? What is that? And he said, in Hinayana Buddhism, only one bodhisattva. In Mahayana Buddhism, many, many bodhisattvas. In Zen Buddhism, kill all bodhisattvas. And then he said something like, so don't make anything, okay? But still the breadcrumbs are there, And just because a Zen teacher gives you an answer like that, never accept that answer or any other answer. One way of interpreting an answer like that from Zen Master Sung San or any other teacher is it's like when you're a kid and you keep asking your parents questions and they say, go look it up. I don't know if your parents ever told you that, or go find out for yourself. Yeah, so is all existence suffering? Well, of course, we know that it's not, right? Because sometimes we are happy. We must be happy sometimes, otherwise we wouldn't know what suffering is. We would have no concept of suffering if there was only suffering. There could be no concept of suffering if there wasn't some other state that we were aware of, that we have experienced ourselves, that was better, better than suffering. And So a lot of times in Buddhist teaching, and especially in Zen teaching, we're told, that the mind that wants to stop suffering is the problem, or the mind that wants to get something is the problem. Which is true, kind of. But what do you do with that? What can you do with that? What's the application of that? What's the practice of that? And so in a way, the practice of that is just to keep, is the practice of questioning. But the Buddha, in the very first teaching that he gave, or at least the first teaching that he gave after the Avatamsaka Sutra, was the Four Noble Truths. And basically, to understand, what was the Buddha doing when he taught the Four Noble Truths? He was saying, oh, hey, so you don't like suffering? And you prefer happiness? Well, here's what you can do. He didn't say, oh, it is the very mind that doesn't want to suffer and that wants to be happy. That's the problem. He said, oh, no. You can bring about the cessation of suffering and bring about the true happiness, lasting happiness. So in you can do it. It's possible. It's attainable. It's something that you can get. And here's how to get it. And so the way to get it is the Four Noble Truths, which includes the Eightfold Path as the fourth of the Four Noble Truths. And so the Four Noble Truths are the truth of suffering, the truth of what are they again? Oh yeah, that's right. The truth of suffering, the truth of the origin of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. And there's a subtle little tricky thing that's involved in this, which is that the cessation of suffering is in a sense not something that can be brought about. So if you stop suffering, the state that you are in when you stop suffering was already there. It's just that you've gotten rid of the suffering. So in that sense, it's not brought about. You could say that it's uncovering something that was already there. But the truth of suffering, and to understand why sometimes it's either said or strongly implied that all life is suffering or existence itself is suffering. You have to, or at least one way of helping us to understand some breadcrumbs that we can follow, are the three types of suffering. And the three types of suffering are, we can relate to the four vows when we recite the four vows. Greed, hatred, and ignorance rise endlessly. I vow to abandon them. Which is not really a good translation. It's an excellent translation. Well, it's an excellent paraphrase, because in the original version of the Four Great Vows, it just says the kleshas are without end. I vow to extinguish them or get rid of them. But spelling it out, not just saying the kleshas, but actually so kleshas is a Sanskrit word for suffering, but more the more what we feel when we're suffering, which is the afflictive emotions. But where do those come from? They come from greed, hatred, and ignorance. Those are the three roots of suffering, also known as the three poisons. And so there's the suffering that's caused by things that are bad. All right, so that's that's caused by the fact that we don't like things that are bad. We have an idea that something is bad and we don't like it. That's hatred or just aversion. So if something comes along and the mind says, "Oh, this is something that I don't like," then we suffer. And that's sometimes that's just called the suffering of suffering. It's the most straightforward and the easiest type of suffering to understand. It's the type of suffering that we usually think of when we think of suffering. We think of something that we don't like happening and us suffering as a consequence of that thing that we don't like. But that's not all there is to it. If you could just get rid of everything that you don't like, then wouldn't you just always be happy? But we actually kind of know that that's not true. And one of the reasons that we know that that's not true is because we experience all the time the reality that when we get something that we like, that can also cause suffering. And this is sometimes referred to as the suffering of impermanence. So the first type of suffering is the suffering of suffering, just the usual, the most obvious type of suffering. It could also be called that, the most obvious type of suffering, which is the suffering that we experience when something unpleasant happens to us. And the unpleasant thing could just be, I'm hungry, right? And so the sensation of hunger is unpleasant. As long as there's food around, then that unpleasantness isn't too bad. But if you're hungry and you don't have any food, then that can be a pretty severe form of suffering. But what about when you're hungry and you do have food? In fact, you have whatever your favorite food is. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, ice cream. Ice cream does not cause happiness. Ice cream is not a source of happiness. And we know this because at a certain point, if you just keep eating ice cream, you don't just get more and more happy. Anything that is truly a source of happiness, then the more you have of it, the more happy you are. Money, ice cream, fame. One of the things that people crave is fame. Fame, pretty infamously, often does not lead to happiness, even though many people have devoted their entire lives to trying to become famous, or not even not well liked. So this is the suffering of impermanence, and the suffering of impermanence simply points to the fact that just as bad things lead to suffering, the things that we think of as good also lead to suffering, because we lose, if for no other reason than the fact that we will eventually lose them. And then the third type of suffering, so the suffering of suffering is caused by aversion, the things that we have an aversion for. The suffering of impermanence is caused by attachment, the things that we are attached to, the things that we like. The third kind of suffering is called the suffering of impermanence. No, that was the second kind. The suffering of conditioning. Or it's also sometimes called the all-pervasive suffering of samsara. And so this is really where the idea that existence is suffering comes from. And so the first kind of suffering comes from aversion, and that's pretty easy to see. The second type of suffering comes from attachment or clinging or desire or greed. When we say greed, hatred, and ignorance, that's the greed part of greed, hatred, and ignorance. And that's also pretty easy to see. It isn't, we normally think that bad things cause suffering and good things cause happiness, but if you think about it, we actually look at our own life and our own experiences, it's not that hard to see that, getting what we want also brings about suffering, which leaves ignorance. Which is the cause of the all-pervasive suffering of samsara, also known as the suffering of conditioning. And as long as we are caught in this cycle of trying to avoid what we don't like and chasing after what we do like, that's samsara. And the reason why this is called the suffering of ignorance is because, or the suffering of conditioning, is because as long as we follow our conditioning, then we're acting out of ignorance, and we're just going to suffer more. One of the most pernicious things about acting out of our conditioning is that there's a tendency to think, well, that's just the way I am. And it is the way I am. It's the way that I am conditioned to be. But the way that I am conditioned to be, by the very nature of the fact that I am conditioned to be that way, means that I've been conditioned to be that way, which means I could condition myself to be another way. And so unlike the suffering of suffering and the suffering of impermanence, the suffering of conditioning actually can give us some hope that we act in this way out of our own ignorance about how things really are and how things really work, ignorance about what causes suffering and what causes happiness. And if we could understand a little better what really causes suffering and what really causes happiness, then at least we'd be following the breadcrumbs in the right direction. But at best, this is just some more breadcrumbs. One of the ways to, if you're interested in learning about Buddhism, one of the ways of knowing whether or not you're doing it right is whether or not you develop more don't know mind. If you study Buddhism and you have more don't know mind, more questions, more questioning, than you did before, then you're probably doing it right. If you study some Buddhism and you think, aha, I've got it, then you might be doing it wrong. So the Buddha taught, if you don't like suffering, if you want to be happy, here's how it works. And so, so the one little thing that I think is important for us to add to that is that everybody doesn't like suffering. Everybody wants happiness. Everyone is just like us. And one of the best ways to get a sense of what ignorance is really all about and why ignorance is the root of suffering is because the most basic and fundamental symptom of ignorance is the concept of I versus other, self versus other. And so seeking to end suffering and seeking happiness for I, that is ignorance. That is the idea of self versus other. Whereas seeking happiness for others is, the unlike ice cream, the more you can do to benefit others, the better it is. And so may all beings understand suffering and the causes of suffering, and also understand happiness and the true causes of happiness. Thank you for listening.